Hello and welcome back to Mr. Orr's Flipped Classroom for Grammar. Today we're going to be looking at the 9th grammar lab, looking at comparatives and superlatives, double negatives. Our main idea today is really how do we avoid common errors when it comes to using adjectives and adverbs. As usual, you got your notes we'll take care of in this video, filling those in. On the next screencast, we'll look at the practice together. And then on the third screencast or in class, you'll do the sentence lab, which is coming up at the very end. All right, that said, let's go ahead and start with the notes. All right, avoiding errors with adjectives and adverbs. So to correctly make comparisons, we have to actually do more counting. It's not as simple as simply choosing the ER or EST. There's a little more to it than that. So for example, we have to remember that comparisons can be either adjectives or adverbs. That's why we did that lesson already. Comparative form. When we use that form, it compares to and only to of something. It's not more than to, it's not less than, it's always to and only to. So the comparative form is usually the more or the ER form of the word. Superlative. That compares more than to. That's the most or the EST form. So one thing to already be mindful of is to count how many things are being compared. For example, if you have one sibling, then one of you is not the oldest, one of you is not the youngest, because there's only two of you. You can only be oldest or youngest if there are three or more. If there's only two of you, there's the older and the younger, not oldest and youngest. So sometimes we use these terms commonly, but they don't actually make sense because we're not using them correctly. There are some irregular comparisons to keep in mind. How good and well become better and best. And we'll talk about the difference between good and well here shortly too. But they both become better or best. That's no real relation to good and well, but that's how we use them. Bad goes from worse to worst. Much or many becomes more or most when we're making those comparison forms. Little becomes less or lesser and becomes least in that superlative sense. How we use these. First, we need to find a word that needs to be changed. Then we determine if there are two or more than two nouns being compared. So we have to decide, is it comparative or is it superlative? We have to really see how we're using comparisons here. And then for spelling, use more or most, not ER, EST. When do we use these? Well, short version is, if you're in doubt, use the more or most. If you're not sure if it sounds right, use more or most. In some cases, you can use either. In most cases, there are some rules you can follow with it. For example, for most words with three or more syllables already, if there's three or more syllables already in the word, typically you want to use more or most because adding a fourth syllable can really become complex and hard to pronounce. Most ly words usually don't say ly and then add er to it. Typically, you're going to say more or most for a slowly, quickly, that sort of thing. And again, I still recommend using more or most, basically when you're trying to sound less awkward. But if you're not sure if it sounds right, go with more or most. First example. Which was more confusing, the book, the movie, or the teacher? So the idea of being compared is how the amount of confusion. So we have more confusing, and then we look at our list of three things. We have book, movie, or teacher. What's being compared is confusing. How many items are being compared? How many things compared? Book, movie, teacher. Those are three nouns. If we have three, we should be using most instead of more. All right, some commonly confused modifiers. This isn't about you knowing the difference between adjective and adverb as much as understanding how and when to use each of these. For example, the word good is always an adjective. It's always describing a person, a place, a thing, an idea. It's always describing a noun. The exception is if you're talking about good as in the idea of good, like good versus evil. In that situation, good as an idea is a noun. It's a thing. Otherwise, good is a describing word, always describing nouns. Well is an adjective only when it means healthy. And so if you're trying to decide between good and well, one way to check whether you should use well or not is if the word healthy works in that place where you have the word well. I don't feel well. I don't feel healthy. Then well is the correct word. If healthy makes sense, well is the correct one. Bad, again, always an adjective. Real, always an adjective. Again, if it's an adjective, it has to be describing a person, a place, a thing, or an idea. Okay? You can't do bad unless it's the opposite of doing good. It's like doing evil. Okay? Now compare that to adverbs. Well is typically what we use an adverb. So unless well means healthy, well is always an adverb. Well is a high quality of an action. You do something well. Do is an action verb. Therefore, well is going to describe that action. That's what adverbs do. They describe action verbs. Badly is kind of the opposite of doing something well. You do something badly. If you do something bad, it means it's like doing something evil in that regard. Do something badly means you're not good at it. Really, again, really is one of those intensifying adverbs. So if you can replace it with very, really is the correct choice. Because remember, very is always an adverb. Again, we're covering a lot of ground here, so it's okay if you need to stop it, go back to it, or ask some questions in class as well. So how do we use these? Well, first we need to find a word that needs to be changed. Again, this time here, the recommendation is you substitute a helpful synonym to check the accuracy of your choice. Again, those helpful synonyms, if you want to use healthy in the place of that good or well, if healthy works, then well is the correct word. If you're using really, can you use very? If you're trying to decide between real and really, does very work? If very works, then you need to use really. For example, you also can use bad when the word ill works, ill being the opposite of well or healthy. Use badly when poorly works. And then really when very fits in a sentence. If you're trying to decide if you should use real or not, again, real versus really, does very work? If it doesn't, odds are pretty good you need to go with real. If very does work, use really. Bad and badly. If poorly makes sense, then go with badly. If not, use bad. So you don't have to remember both sides of these particular examples. If you can remember one way to tell the difference between when to use really and real, when to use bad and badly, when to use well versus good, if you remember one of those examples, it should help you figure out when to use either of those two opposites. Next example. You did good. Okay? So to do good sounds like you're some sort of superhero. You're doing something that's as opposed to doing something evil. In this case, you probably mean you did something well. What is that thing you did? Is it you sang? We sang well. You didn't sing good. Unless then there's a name good of a song. You did something well. You sang well. You ran well. You spoke well. Again, it describes the high quality of an action. So that's adverbs. Good is an adjective describing a noun. All right, double negatives. People are pretty clear when it comes to you can't use no twice in a sentence or no and not. But negative words aren't just no, not, never, and none. Negative words also include words like nobody, no one, nothing, and nowhere. So if you say not nobody, not nothing, that's a double negative, and therefore it's confusing. Because a double negative in math would make it positive. Well, that's not the case. If you say something's not something, it just means that it's not that. It doesn't mean it's the opposite of it. It just means it's not that. If something's not nothing, the implication is it's something, but it can be confusing. So we try to avoid double negatives because it can confuse the reader. Also, there's some words that aren't starting with N or aren't the word not that also are considered negative words and therefore shouldn't be combined with no, not, never, none. So barely, rarely, scarcely, and hardly. Those ones are considered negative words. So don't say can't, hardly. That would be a double negative there. Don't say neither, not neither. Neither is really the word not, either put together. Also watch out for contractions using N apostrophe T because it really is still the word not. So N apostrophe T is a negative. Again, watch out for, like I said, can't, hardly. That's like saying not, no one. So watch out for those words here too. For negative words, how we use them, find a negative word in a sentence. That includes the barely, rarely, scarcely, hardly. See where the second negative word is used, which may cancel the first. Again, double negative kind of makes it positive. So avoid having those two negatives. The exception to that is neither and nor. Those go together. Other than that, avoid the double negatives. Either delete the excess negative word or consider changing the excess negative word to any. As opposed to not, none, is it not any? Would be a way to revise that. Third example, you can't never do that. So we look at our negative words. We have not and never. The best way to change that is to drop an N on there, drop a negative. So can't ever do that. Or you can never do that. So notice in both cases, we've taken one of the two negatives and gotten rid of one of them. Either way is fine, but we can't have both those negatives there at the same time. I don't want to bother no one else. So we have N apostrophe T is a negative and no one else. So options, I don't want to bother anyone else. Because even if I look at it, no way saying I want to bother no one else. That sounds weird. All right. At this point, we're going to go ahead and pause on your notes. There's a lot of ground covered. The practice that we do the next class is going to be even more important. So go ahead, take your time, make sure your notes are complete. Make some extra questions on your notes page to ask your teacher before you start the practice in case you have some of those questions or uncertainties.